So photographic art is there's a lot of, in this case, black and white images, which are photographic, but they're not necessarily what I'm referring to. Photographic art is more like this. It's the combination of a theme in this case. It's taking something like the sky in an image and incorporating it into a broader composition. There's multiple images that are present in something like this. You've probably also seen it in, let's see here. See if I can find one elsewhere before we begin. Photographic art. Okay, I'll shelve that for a moment, but because I'm not seeing many good compositions that I want to showcase. But we're taking two images and we're putting them together. And the way that we do that is by using layers. So just as a very preliminary question, how many people have created their own photographic art in ACDSee, and how many people are really unfamiliar with this concept and haven't done anything on their own? Just a sort of yes or no in regards to that. Rick Semi, okay, not yet. Chris, awesome. I should really create a little sub. Torres said yes. Ricardo, you have not in ACDSee. No, okay. For those of you might have tried this in Photoshop, but a lot of the capacities that ACDSee have to create these images is equal to that. Once badly, okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's also something too that most changing backgrounds from studio shots with gray backgrounds. Yeah, totally. What Rick just mentioned is taking some degree of photo from a photo shoot and just changing the background to make it completely solid, because a lot of photo shoot backgrounds are sometimes incorporate shadows and stuff, which is what you're trying to avoid. Okay. This is an introductory workshop. And so by that I want to sort of get into the absolute nuts and bolts of this process and sort of describe how layers work in ACDSee, and then we'll look at sort of how we can incorporate like multiple images to create sort of in this case a photographic art piece. The other thing I want to mention too, I'm just going to open up this image for now. The other thing I really want to mention is that ACDSee in 2025 and in the last couple versions has created such a strong selection, has created such strong selection tools. And you might know these as AI actions. These are ways that we can create selections in ACDSee. There's more than this too. We've incorporated some really good manual selection tools. And then the other thing, most recently, we've also incorporated things like channel and luminance selection. So there's a lot of tools to make accurate selections. But perhaps before we get to that, we need to stop and like actually look at layers and think about what that looks like and sort of describe it in a bit more depth. So what are layers? So layers are it's a stack, or rather a sort of a visual presentation of multiple files. And so our layers panel on the right here contains, in this case, can contain multiple images. And the way you've probably interacted with a layer system is by adding an adjustment layer to your file. For example, when I go about adding an exposure adjustment, you can see that exposure adjustment as an adjustment layer, right, has been placed over top of my image. And so when I go to make exposure adjustment, for example, if I was to increase the contrast in my image, you can see that contrast is then applied to the image that appears beneath it. And so what is implied by this, even if we're not necessarily interacting with photographic art or making our own compositions, is that the topmost layer is always being applied to the layers that appear beneath it. And there's sort of rules to that, but we'll describe that in more detail in a moment. But layer order really matters. And so what we should take away from this is that layers that appear at the top are taking visual precedence over layers that appear beneath them, or layers that appear at the bottom. The way that we can illustrate this too is if I was to take this image of my beetle, my VW bus, or my VW here, and if I was to raise it above the exposure adjustment, you can see that the exposure adjustment is no longer applied, and essentially the image is returned back to its default settings. And so what this illustrates to me is that when I'm interacting with my file, exposure being on top here is important, and it takes a visual precedent over the image that appears beneath it. So this does not just apply to adjustment layers. So just sort of a quick lay of the land here. So layers and the layer panel itself is just depicts the order in which of operations that we have that were the effects or visual presentation is being applied. And then this preview is a representation of the layer order that we see on the right here. Underneath of that is adjustment layers, and we can think of adjustment layers as exactly what they sound like. They're adjustments that are interpreted, or rather sort of presented to us as layers that appear in our layer order. This is pretty different than filters. Filters are a change that is applied directly to the image, but not added as a layer. So when we're talking about edit mode and we're talking about layers, one of the things to consider is that filters are sort of filters are destructive. Let's just very quickly prove this. I'm going to just make a quick exposure adjustment to my image in the same way that I made an exposure adjustment here. So if I expose my image and I happen to increase the contrast of my image using a filter and click done. So all I did here was click the exposure filter on the left-hand panel. You can see that the filter is not presented to me in such a way that I can edit it or interact with it. And so what this suggests to me is that the filter itself is destructive. So I can't, if I was to save this file as an ACDSee file, which by definition is a file that means that I can reopen it and engage with it in the future. This particular change that I've made to this image is not one that I can interact with. Unless, however, I can undo it, but undoing is only something I can do in an active session. And as soon as I leave the session, it forgets the history of the actions that I create. But whereas this exposure adjustment is one that I can add to this, and once again, as I save this image as a ACDSee file, this is something that I can interact with at any point. And basically I can move this, I can adjust the values, I can remove it, etc. Let's prove this. So I'm just going to save this as an ACDSee file in this layers folder that I've created, and then I'm just going to call this working file. And so when I save this file here, what I'm going to see is that if I was to navigate away from this file, back to manage mode, you can see that an ACDSee file is created here. ACDSee is a proprietary file for our edit mode. This is the file that contains all of the in this case, layers that we can interact with. Files that aren't ACDSee files are flattened by definition. So if I was to open this image that contains these layers, you can see that these layers are preserved. So my exposure appears above my image, my beetle here. And so the takeaway from that is that this layer order that I've applied, in this case, with the image that appears beneath it, is quote unquote non-destructive because I can edit it, move it, change it, delete it, etc. Okay, so the takeaway from that should be that the layer panel itself contains a layer that's sort of linear with the topmost adjustment being applied to the image that appears beneath it. And then secondarily that this is something that is preserved. It's preserved when I save this as an ACDSee file versus something like a filter, which is applied directly to the layer and is then once it's complete and the file is sort of saved and moved away from, that is flattened and therefore no longer editable. I've talked a lot about this in the past where when interacting with the filter menu, it's a good idea to create a duplicate of your image. And what that means is that if I was to take my image layer itself here, it would be a good idea to make a duplication of that. And that way, even if I'm making a filter adjustment to one of my layers, that would mean that I'd be able to preserve the original. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So I'm just going to pause on that and we'll come back to it. Other things about the layer panel. So Bob asked, how is the panel opened? Well, in edit mode, the panel itself should be already visible to you on the right by default. However, there should be a panes window. Let's see here. Is it panes or is it view? Layers, F8. If by any chance you're working in Ultimate and you don't see a layer panel, it's possible that the layer panel has been hidden from view, in which case we need to ensure that the pane showcases that the layers is visible there. And there should be a check mark next to it. The other thing that occasionally comes up, that this whole right-hand panel, for example, is considered something called an ACDSee called a workspace. And so ACDSee saves the layout that you have created here. And sometimes people accidentally click on the hide right-hand panel button. And what that does is it sort of removes it from view. And this is remembered when we open or close ACDSee. So this is sort of a workspace tool that allows us to sort of increase the size of our actual thumbnail in this case by removing a panel itself. Although remove is a hard term, it's really just hiding it. And that's the case for both the left, top, and side panels as well. Probably pretty rare for you to open up edit mode and to have all three of these panels removed, because it means that we're not really interacting with our image very easily. But that is sort of the reason why we might not see layers on the right-hand side. So hopefully that answers your question, Bob. So we've discussed how adjustment layers are visible on in this layer order. But there's one other thing that's also, or rather two other things that are also visible in this layer order, and we'll describe them right now. The first and perhaps easiest to understand is to just add something called a blank layer. So we've talked about how image layers, like this guy, our image itself, the beetle, is present in our layer order. We've also talked about the fact that adjustment layers are visible in the layer order. But what about blank layers? What are they? So if I click on this plus button beneath the adjustment layers panel itself, it will add above my active layer a blank layer. In this case, a blank layer contains essentially no information, no pixel information at least. And what that means is that every pixel in this layer is by default blank. It has no values to it. And in essence, they're empty. Blank layers can be filled. They can be filled with a variety of different things. But one of the most common things that we can do with blank layers is to fill them with a color or an overlay color, for example. So what does this look like? If I was to take my layer 1 here, which is my blank layer, let's rename it. I can take something like my pen tool, for example, my brush tool. And if I wanted to, I can brush into the blank layer. So just as a very simple default action here, I'm just going to brush white on. And as you can see that layer contains this white information in the center of my image here. So, and because of the layer order, we can see that exposure is being applied first and foremost, and it's being applied to the images that appear beneath it. And then so we can see that the blank layer is being affected, and the actual layer, the beetle layer itself, is also being affected. If I was to take this blank layer and move it beneath my beetle image, for example, it would no longer be visible. There's reason for this. So when I have my blank layer and I have it positioned underneath my layer here, if there are no transparencies in my image, in essence, that there isn't any masking or opacity adjustments to my image, the layer that appears beneath it will be hidden from view. And the reason why is because we can look at this image and think about every single minutia of pixel. So if I was to really zoom in on my image and think about all of these little pixels in my image, all of these would have a sort of opacity value or transparency of 100, meaning that every single image, every single pixel in my image is fully opaque. It is being presented to me fully. Whereas if this image itself had a lowered opacity, right? So if I was to reduce the opacity of this image, this image is going to start to become more transparent. And so we'll showcase what that looks like. So you can see that the image becomes much lighter. And if I zoom out, you can see that the image is considerably lighter. It's fainter. And this blank layer that appears beneath it here, this like white line that we've created, is now visible to us because of the fact that we adjusted this opacity. So what this should tell us, right, is in the case of my my beetle layer, this car image, every pixel in this image is now basically 50% of the pixels in my image are now transparent. If I was to adjust this value and say the value is 25, now 75% of the pixels in my image are transparent and 25% of the pixels in my image are fully opaque. And we can adjust this once again by showcasing that when I adjust it to 75, 25% of the pixels in my image are now transparent and 75% of the pixels in my image are opaque. When we change these values, one of the things you're going to notice is that this checkerboard pattern appears beneath my image here. Hopefully everybody can see that checkerboard pattern. If I hide this image from view altogether, you can see that that checkerboard pattern is there. That checkerboard pattern is really important. And basically what it describes to me, specifically when interacting with an image in edit mode, interacting with layers, is it tells me that there's no visual information on that layer. So now that I have no images in my layer that are visible, I've gone about and hidden both of these images from view, clicking on the little hide icon here. One of the takeaways here is that this image now contains no visual information whatsoever and is essentially blank. That's because there's no image in my file here that has pixels being presented to us. So when I have an image that has a lowered opacity, that is also presented to us, right? Let's go back now to my blank layer. I'm just going to place it above my layer here. Blank layers can contain a variety of different content, right? In this case, I had a blank layer that contained a white streak that we drew on. I'm just going to add another blank layer that contains no information right now. If I was to fill this blank layer with, let's just say I'm going to fill the whole blank layer itself with the color red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to my fill tool. I'm just going to change the foreground color by using the color picker itself. And I selected the color red. Provided that I had my layer 1 selected here, when I go to click on my image, the actual thumbnail itself, that entire layer will be filled with red. So what we're going to see here is two things. First and foremost, we're going to see that by filling this layer, it now takes visual priority over the image of the beetle that appears beneath it. And as such, the beetle is no longer, or the car is no longer visible. So the reason for this is because, once again, this layer has full opacity, so it presides over top of the image layer, and 100% of the pixels in this image are being presented to us. And so it overrides the image that appears beneath it. This, of course, changes when I adjust the opacity. So if I adjust the opacity of this red color, this layer 1 here, to 50%, right? The image that appears beneath it is now going to be visible. And the reason why is because this layer 1, this red layer that we see here, 50% of the pixels in my image are fully transparent, and 50% of the pixels in my image are fully opaque. And what this does is, if we were to think about this image as its own checkerboard, every second block, every second square in this image would be then, a color. In this case, it would be fully opaque, and every other pixel would be fully transparent. So what I want to illustrate to you is that, okay, first and foremost, we know that layer order matters. We were able to see that with something like the exposure. By placing the exposure above another layer, we can see that that impacts the image that appears beneath it. But the same is also true for other layers. We can see that just by adding a blank layer and placing it above, that layer takes visual priority over other layers. And one of the things that I hope to illustrate to you is that there are ways in which we can blend or merge layers together. And one of the most simple ways is by interacting with the opacity of a layer. By interacting with the opacity of a layer, other layers become visible that appear beneath it, which otherwise wouldn't be visible. Let's think about this in a different way. I'm going to just tuck this red layer beneath, and as such, we can see that that layer is no longer visible. If I was to click on this car layer, we can see that the opacity is still set at 100 here, which means that it is fully opaque and it's being presented in full value. Actually, interestingly, if I was to increase the opacity of my red layer and lower the opacity of my car layer, you can see that the same effect is going to be applied, right? In that that car appears pretty red to us because it's now presenting the image that appears beneath it, which is this red layer. So inversely, I can do the same thing when I lower the opacity of the layer that appears above it, in the same way that when I had that red layer appear above, I could also apply that to the car layer that appeared beneath it. Okay, so let's think about this in a different way. So we've seen that exposure, or like adjustment layers, can affect the image layers. We can see that very clearly that blank layers can affect the image stack. The other thing that can be affected is, let's just add a random other layer. I'll just add a cloud layer. And what I'm doing here is I'm dragging and dropping an image from my film strip onto my layer order. Another way to do what I just did would be to click on the underneath the adjustment layers. There's a add a file as a layer button. By clicking on add a file as a layer, it will bring me up a browse window, and it will allow me to add essentially a second image or second photograph to my layer order. So I've done that. I've added this layer. I'll just illustrate, I guess, one more time. I'm just going to click on that little icon there, click on this photo, click open, and it opens the image. Just a quick note, although it's not necessarily that important to know, when you open up a file, you'll be prompted to place the file. You can see that the file that I'm placing is actually a little bit bigger than the artboard that I'm interacting with. I just need to place it and click commit. When I click commit, it is finalized. So what you can see now is you can see that my cloud layer, okay, is the topmost layer on my layer order. Let's just remove exposure for now because it's unnecessary for this description. But we can see that this cloud layer appears on the very top of my image stack. And as such, barring any form of masking or opacity adjustment, you can see that it takes full visual priority because all of the pixels in my image are opaque and being presented to me. If that was to change, for example, if I was to reduce the opacity in the same way that I reduced the opacity with the red layer, you can see that 50% of my cloud layer appears kind of over top of my bus layer. And on a very, very rudimentary level, this is one of the fundamental aspects of making photographic art, which is adjusting the opacity of one layer that appears above another layer. And so, like, before we get even into masking, you can play around with these values, this sort of opacity layer itself, and to create a composition that incorporates different layers. This is just opacity. Opacity is a pretty binary adjustment in that as we reduce this value, it's hiding, I guess, fewer pixels from us. Or sorry, it's hiding more pixels. The other thing that we can do, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on this because it's a whole workshop in of itself, but right next to opacity here, there is something called, I guess it's not labeled or named here, but this is called a blend mode. A blend mode functions very similar to opacity in that it will blend one image to images that appear beneath it. However, it does it algorithmically, and so each blend mode has a different order of operations and how it applies. I'm just going to showcase a couple that I like, and so you can see what I mean. So much like opacity will blend an image with the image appears beneath it, blend modes will do the same. If I was to multiply an image, so in this case, I've multiplied my sky layer over top of my car layer. You can see that the way that this image is blended is now different from just opacity on its own. Can everybody see that? Or alternatively, if I was to click on multiply and go to something like, let's say overlay, you can see that the way that this is blended is different than the way that we saw earlier. Again, let's try this once more. If I was to apply, let's say, a color blend, the way that this is being applied is different than just opacity. However, the effect that I'm seeing is that these two images I can sort of see together. I can see some of the qualities of my sky layer over top of some of the qualities of my car layer. Okay. So just a bit of a summary because we're already covering quite a bit of things. Just maybe a pause right now and I can ask the question, is everyone following along? Is there anything that anyone doesn't understand? Happy to answer any questions as we go through. I'm just going to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions if there's anything they're uncertain of. Thanks, Rick. Feel free to add your comment in. Okay, so what we've showcased here is a couple things. We've showcased that the layer order itself matters, and how it matters is by a degree of priority. And so priority is established first and foremost at the top of the layer order. And the only thing that changes that priority is some form of blending, right? The other thing that changes priority is masking. And we'll talk about that in a moment now as well. This really is an effective tool at, I guess in this case, presenting layer order, right? And that this is the order that we're seeing here is something that's easily accessible. It's something that's easy to change. And it's also a very a common way to sort of start the process of interacting with an image to create a composition. Okay, so let's think about this a little bit differently. We've talked about blending, talked about layers. We've talked a little bit about destructibility and non-destructibility when it comes to the images here. Let's sort of now start the process of interacting with the idea of masking. Masking is when we really start to interact with the concept of layers, and it's going to build on what we've already established. Then we'll start to talk about selections and how selections will impact your final image. And that will probably round out the way that we're going to talk about layers today. Okay, so let's make a mask. So what I've done here is I've just removed the other layers. They're going to probably complicate this interaction. So I just want to just want to make this as simple and easy to understand as possible. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add two layers to my layer order here. And let's just add blue and red. Okay. So I have a blue layer above a red layer. So what I see here is a presentation of that layer order. You can see that when I have my blue layer up top, it's visually presented to us. And when I have my red layer up top, it's visually presented to us. If I was to, I don't know, say, let's reduce the opacity on my red layer, you get purple, right? Pretty simple understanding. In this case, 50% of the pixels in my red layer are being presented to us. 100% of the blue is being presented to us below that, in which case the color that you get is purple. set the opacity back to 100. Masking is a tool for making selections in your image, right? And fundamentally, what masking does is it hides parts of your image and showcases parts of your image. What we're going to illustrate later is how we can make selections that inform what the mask looks like. But we need to first understand the mask on a fundamental basis. So my layer 1 here, let's add a mask to the layer. So we've interacted with these 3 buttons so far. We've interacted with the add a file as a layer. We've added a blank layer. I briefly discussed duplicating a layer, but just to reiterate it, all it does is it makes a copy of the active layer. Just so we are aware too and know, the active layer is the layer that's highlighted. It is a lighter color than the other layers. Then we have the ability to delete layer, and then we won't talk about the 3 other ones. That's not relevant to this workshop. But the most relevant to our workshop today is add layer mask. You've already seen masks. We'll add an exposure adjustment, and we'll showcase what the mask is. So when I add an exposure adjustment, there's this little white box that appears in my image. And this white box is a mask. Masks are typically associated with adjustment layers because they allow us to change the relationship of exposure to the layers that beneath us, the layers that appear beneath it. However, masks can also just be added to image layers, like the car image that we had, or like these blank color layers that we have here as well. So when I add a mask to this image, this little white box appears. This is called a mask thumbnail, and it appears to the right of the layer itself. Masks are different from the layer themselves. When I interact with a mask, what I'm doing is I'm telling ACDSee to hide or display certain parts of the image that I'm seeing. And what does that mean? When I'm interacting with a mask, white indicates to me that a mask is fully opaque or fully visible, or in other words, turned on. When I interact with a mask that's black, it's telling me the opposite values. So if I was to right click on this mask and set it as black, that turns my layer off. And what it does is it showcases to me that the layer that appears beneath it is now visible because this layer is no longer being prioritized. So masking is a way to interact with layer order that doesn't have us moving the layer order or interacting with blending. So what I should take away from this is that when I have a mask selected, white means that that is being presented to us. It's visually turned on and it's sort of being shown. And that black is turning that layer off or taking those elements and no longer presenting them to us. So when I invert the mask itself, you can see that the thumbnail changes. So you can see that the thumbnail swaps between black and white. And this is going to be important in a moment. But the takeaway here is that masks can be either black or white, and that they are indicative of showing us our layer or parts of our layer. Now, I've said parts a couple times, but right now what I'm doing is I'm just taking the whole mask and I'm turning it black and I'm turning it white. So what part is necessarily being changed? That's a really interesting and good point. So if I was to take this mask here, and really importantly, if I was to take this mask and I was to make a brush stroke over my image, right? When I'm brushing on a mask, it's going to hide parts of my image from view. This is a bad example because it's too gray, but let me go back here. Let's increase the opacity. There we go. That's much better. So when I take my brush tool and I brush on the opposite color that the mask is, so in this case, I'm using the white foreground color to brush on a black mask. You can see that when I do that, the layer is being shown, right? In this case, I'm taking a mask that is fully turned off. It is a black mask. And I'm drawing on white in this case. And so white shows the red layer that I'm sort of that the mask is associated with. Inversely, let's just erase this for a moment and talk about the opposite relationship. If I have a layer that's fully turned on, what I can do is I can erase parts of my image by drawing on, in this case, black. Black being turning that part of my image off versus turning it on. And so in this image, what I have here is essentially a box in the center of my image here. And you can see that that is reflected in the thumbnail that appears beneath my image or beside my image. The image itself is turned on, it's white, but there's a section or selection in the center of my mask that indicates that I'm actually turning it off. And by turning it off, it's showcasing the layer that appears beneath it, the blue layer, right? So whenever I'm interacting with a mask, I can use the white and black sort of brush strokes to illustrate or showcase elements that appear beneath it. And so what I'm essentially doing is I'm making a selection with my mask. I'm brushing on my mask, and I'm illustrating or highlighting the image that appears beneath it. So masking is really powerful at ways of combining images. So I'm combining two images together using masking to sort of showcase parts of one image and the other, creating a composition that incorporates both of those components. So in this case, I guess ultimately what I'm seeing here is, okay, so I'm seeing a red layer that's presented to me at the top of my layer order. So it's taking visual priority. And then I'm using masking to turn off, in this case, the shape of a smiley face in the center of my image. By turning it off, it's going to showcase the image layer that appears beneath it. If I was to simply hide my blue layer, right, and there's no longer anything that's being visually presented underneath my layer, you can see that that transparency that we talked about earlier is being presented to me. This means that in the vacuum of a layer that appears beneath it, now nothing is there. Nothing appears underneath that, and it is now blank. So hopefully what this illustrates is that by masking images, right, we can showcase parts of one image and hide the other. This is a pretty binary representation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add an image layer. Let's just add this car image layer back. And let's, instead of what I have here, let's add a cloud layer. I'm going to pull a cloud layer on top of my image here. Actually, I'll place it beneath it. So what I have here is my car layer, and it appears, as you can see above. Oops, that's a whole working file, not the image layer. There we go. That's better. The car layer appears over top of the cloud layer. So what I can do to my image here is just the same way that I drew the smiley. I can add a mask to my layer, and by adding a mask, this enables me to interact with the thumbnail. So I can turn this thumbnail off to hide my image from view, or I can simply draw on, using a brush stroke, the parts of my image that I want to remove, or in this case, I want to illustrate the image that appears beneath it. It's pretty crude penmanship here, but what this illustrates is that the topmost part of my image is turned off, and therefore the clouds that exist in the image layer beneath it are being presented to us. Whereas the actual foreground here, the image of the car and the grass, is still being presented to me, and therefore white in my image here. So takeaway for crude masking in this case is that white means turned on, black means turned off, and this is a way of interacting with layer order that doesn't necessarily have us using something like blending or opacity. Now we want to introduce a concept called selections, right? So one of the things that I've hopefully illustrated is that when I use my brush strokes in this case, I'm getting sort of like a pretty rough selection of the sky in this image here, right? Pretty rough. But there's other ways of making selections in my image predicated on a variety of different values. So let's just look at making selections for a moment here. So one of the most beneficial ways that we can interact with selections is by simply to use AI actions. So AI actions are relatively new in ACDSee. There's something that we're using more and more of in 2025, but it enables us to select certain aspects of our image. And then from there, it enables us to decide what we want to do with that part of our image. And a part of that, what we can do with the selection is to mask it. So how do I illustrate that? Let's go to a different image and illustrate this. So I have my subject here in an image, just a woman on the street. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask her, but I'm going to mask her by using a selection, or in this case, an AI selection. So before we do that, let's just showcase where selections exist, where we can create selections. So the AI section here, these are ways that we can create selections. Some just skip the selection process, like remove background, blur background, and black and white background. Those are just a fast operation that don't interact with the selection. But the portion up at the top here, these do create selections of my of whatever corresponding criteria there are. The other ones that we can see here are brush selections, or rather manual selections. So manual selections are a way of, in this case, I have my brush tool selected. If I select this part of my image here by brushing it on, an active selection appears, which is sort of illustrated by this red overlay that I'm seeing. If you're new to ACDSee, this red overlay might be a marching ants instead. It might look something like this. I'm not particularly fond of marching ants as a selection method because I feel like it doesn't properly indicate what part of my image I'm selecting. So when I'm start ACDSee for the first time, I navigate to select and go to the overlay options and I change it to selection highlighted. And so what it does is it changes the selection that I have here and it makes it a bit easier to see. So when I have a brush selection and I've brushed on a part of my image here, that then becomes selected. And I can do so many different things with the selection. First and foremost, one of the things we can do is we can take an active selection, like the one of the square around our subject here, and we can add just an adjustment layer, for example. So let's go with exposure just to give an example here. If I click on exposure and I increase exposure, you can see that the exposure thumbnail here, the mask thumbnail, corresponds to the one that I created using my selection, right? So that's one way of interacting with my image. I can now expose my image predicated on a selection. This selection has a mask, or sorry, this exposure adjustment has a mask, as we've discussed earlier. But the other thing we can do is we can make a selection of our subject here, and we can mask accordingly as well. So I can take my image here and have an active selection, in this case, the woman in this image standing on the street, and I can mask it. So a masked woman in this case, this creates this, again, this thumbnail, mask thumbnail next to my image here with the corresponding criteria that I had created with my selection. So when I use the brush selection tool to select a box around my subject here, I have created a mask that corresponds to that. And so the mask tells me that the inner box is visible, right? It's being shown to us, and we know that because it is a white portion of our mask. And the border, I suppose, or the outlining area, I have chosen to deselect. And as a result of that, it is presented as off or black in this part of our image. super crude selection, but there are other selection methods other than just the brush tool. There is the shape selection tool, for example. So I can use a polygonal selection method to go through the process of making a selection. And then that works the exact same way as our brush selection tool. It selects based on that polygon. Let's see here. I can use a rectangular selection tool. Same thing. I'm not going to go into that. I can use something that's probably fairly common and to everybody here, but it's a lasso. So it creates a lasso selection around my subject. Once I close it, it creates that. I can use it to create that mask. And then there's one that is a bit more, I guess, what would be the word for it? Magic wand selection, which is a way to select based on pixel similarity. This is probably best applied if images have very similar color or luminance, brightness in this case. And then finally, we have an AI object selection, which if I use it and I make a selection around my subject here, same way that I would with an AI tool, hopefully it does a good job of seeing what I want to select here. And so you can see that the subject was selected really well, with the exception of, I guess, the foot here, but I could add that in using the brush tool. But that gives me a selection that looks like this. And so as such, I can create a selection or a mask predicated on that selection with my subject here. What else? So maybe that's beyond the scope of this workshop, so we won't talk about that today. But the other thing we can do, like I mentioned earlier, is just use the AI tools themselves to select our subject. So I could use the AI select subject to simply select the subject on my image here. It looks like it captured the foot pretty well in that. Or alternatively, I could do the inverse of this. I could select the background in my image, which will select everything but the subject in this case. Or if I'm interacting with an image that contains a sky, like our car image here, I can use the select sky tool to select the sky in my image and therefore allow me to mask accordingly. So in this image of my bug here, I can use the select sky tool to make a mask of the sky that I see in my image here. And I can display the inverse by clicking on the mask and clicking on invert. And so that presents to me the beetle and the grassy area, but not the sky. Or I can invert it once again, and it will just display the sky here and not the subject matter that appears beneath it. And this is represented once again in the thumbnail itself. So if we look at the thumbnail here, you can see that the white portion of our thumbnail is turned on or visible to us. And the bottom portion, I guess the foreground in this image, is turned off and invisible to us. And so when I do something like invert that mask, you can see that that relationship is shifted. Now the top is what is invisible and turned off, and the bottom is what is turned on and visible to us. So just to sort of bring this home and to sort of finalize this conversation, one of the things that we can do is we can make selections predicated on certain values. So in this image here, I have, let's make a selection. Let's see if I can just make an accurate selection of my subject, which in this case is my beetle. See how well this does. Actually pretty good, really good in fact. So I can select my beetle in my image here. And let's just use the brush tool to add in the grass. And the reason why I'm doing this is that when I went to go about selecting the sky, it just selected the sky in my image, and there was some haziness around the edges, and I'm trying to avoid that. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking an approach of selecting the subject instead of selecting the opposite of one I want to select and then inverting it. So I have an active selection of my bus here, or so my beetle here. And what I can do is I can take the brush selection tool and I can simply add on to this selection. So if I was to, let's maybe lower the feathering, I'll just add on the base of my image here. And that adds that to the selection. And let's add all but the top of the grass here. The other thing I can do is I can use the brush selection tool, right? Let's see here. Yeah, that's probably good enough. And I can use a tool called smart brushing. And smart brushing enables me to add parts of my image without selecting pixels that are too dissimilar from it. So if I'm selecting my grass here, ooh, I want the tolerance way higher. If I select around the grass here, you can see that it's doing a really good job of not, oops, except in that exact case. I can clean that up. It's doing a fairly good job of selecting just the grass, but not too much of the sky in this part of my image here. So I'll go over here and I'll do the exact same. And this one worked a bit easier. I'll just cover that area. And so now what I have is I have my subject selected. I have my the space underneath, the grass in this case, selected, and the sky removed from my selection. Let's see if I can maybe deselect some of this area as well. This being inside the car. This is the sort of, in this case, the windshield. I want to select some of this, but I intend to put an entirely new sky in. And so one of the reasons why I might want to erase these components is because they might conflict with the new element that I'm placing. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to just do as good of a job I can to remove these elements from the selection, which means that they are presented as in this case, they're not red. So I'll go through and I'm just about done here. I might actually increase the feathering just for this process. Oh, it's so much better. Feathering just increases the radius around your nib, which means that the radius effect will be much more gradual. Magic Brush is a part of the brush selection tool, and it's just this drop down bar here. Magic can be turned on or off. In this case, magic brushing incorporates, it's going to see pixels and pixels that are both similar in color and luminance. And then it's going to make informed selections based on that. So I have it turned on, but you can turn it off to just display the brush itself. Sorry, as Jay asked, as you were selecting the window to erase, you also reverse the brush to right. So what Jay's asking is when oops. Why is that not being displayed to me here? Little bug here. Oh, no bug. Okay. What Jay's asking is, so I'm using my right mouse button, and what that right mouse button does is it erases the brush selection, and then I can refill a brush selection by left clicking. So I'm sort of swapping between right clicking and left clicking to sort of erase and repaint on that selection. And so that sort of enables me to make an accurate selection here by not having to navigate back and forth. And so I'm just going to finish finalizing these last couple windows here. And that's good enough for what we're doing here. But ultimately, all I wanted to do was make an accurate selection of my my car here. Oops. I'm going to incorporate that in the selection as well. Yeah, that's way better. There we go. All I wanted to do was make an accurate selection of my car here and remove the sky. And the way I did this was I combined several different selection tools. Firstly, I selected my subject in my image using the AI actions, and that got the bulk of my selection complete for me. And then all I did was use the brush selection tool to brush on the foreground in my image and to brush out the windows. And so what we see here is we now have an active selection. And that active selection is my car, right? When I go to use the masking tool, so I add a mask, the mask will correspond to the car that I see right here, right? So my car is now masked in accordance with whatever my selection was. You can see that my the windows in my image are transparent. as indicated by the transparency of my in the background that we see here. And now what we can do is we can go in and we can just add a layer. So let's add a completely new sky to my image here, and I'll place it beneath my my bug or my car here. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just going to place it like that. That's fine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the exposure of this sky. And when I do that, I add a little exposure adjustment, and you can see that that exposure adjustment is now placed above my sky. And so when I increase the exposure even just slightly, that is only being applied to the image that appears beneath it. So that exposure adjustment means that the sky exposure is increased, but the car that we see in the foreground is not, because exposure appears beneath it in the layer order. Whereas if I was to add, say, a photo effect to my image, and move a photo effect to the top of my layer order, let's just pick a very obvious one. That's pretty obvious, but let's maybe choose a less obvious one. So if I was to make this sepia photo effect, you can see that that sepia photo effect is being applied to my whole image, and that's because it is on the top of my layer order. Now, when I move it underneath, similar to where the exposure is, you can see the photo effect is only being applied to, once again, the image that appears beneath it. So hopefully what we can showcase here is not only can we mask and select out our image, but we can also apply effects like color and luminance adjustments to parts of our image that correspond with, in this case, the layer order. Alternatively, if I wanted this photo effect to just apply to the bug and the foreground, what I could do is I could use this little triangle that appears here, this clipping tool, to clip it just to the image that appears directly beneath it, and no longer and not all of the images that appear beneath it. So I have this capacity to add a photo effect that can be applied to so many different parts of my image here. So let's do a hard light effect. Yeah, we'll do that. So I have a sepia photo effect that is being applied to all of my image here. But if I wanted to apply it to just the image that appears beneath it, I could clip it like that. Or I could move the layer to apply it to images that appear in a different portion of my layer order. Okay, so what we've covered in this workshop, we covered a lot. Layers are, a huge component of ACDSee. But basically, from the ground up, we talked about the layer order and how layer order matters and how to interact with layer order. Starting the process of compositions looks at breaking certain rules, right? For example, one of the rules that we can break early on is just by adjusting opacity and blends to sort of have one layer impact another layer without actually doing any masking adjustments. Then we sort of introduced the process of actually masking our image. And the way that we masked initially was basically just by using a raw mask and the brush stroke itself. So by brushing on a mask, we can remove parts of our image and display the image that appears directly beneath it. This is what I was doing when I was interacting with those blue and red layers. From there, we can actually start the process of, once we understand masking and once we understand how masking certain parts of an image impacts the layers that appear beneath it, then we can talk about actually making accurate selections and masking based on the accuracy, not just a raw brush strokes over our image. So this is where we introduce the concept like AI actions to create active selections that we can then compound on with things like brush tools or the different sort of manual selection methods. And then from there, what we did is we essentially combined those two methods to make a mask that corresponds to a really broad portion of our image here. So we selected our car, but we also masked out the windows in our car. And then we masked that. We took that image and we masked it and then added in a new, in this case, sky, a new background to our image here that corresponds with what we see. That sort of covers everything I wanted to talk about. Masking has been made a lot easier in ACDSee 2025 in the last few versions with AI inclusions. Selections are becoming so much more refined and a lot better in ACDSee. And we're now starting to be able to really create these incredible composition images that incorporate all these different tools and methodologies. So we can look at, or methods rather, not methodologies, methods, but we can incorporate all these different methods to sort of get the best outcome in this case. What else is there more to say? Layer order is a tool ultimately for creating images that combine multiple layers. And that's up to you how you want to do that. Multiple layers could be adjustment layers impacting an image, and those adjustment layers could be masked. Layer order could be having a certain images appear over top of other images with varying degrees of opacity. It could be masking entire two different images together, creating really complex composition images, or it could be something as simple as creating a color overlay. I want to fill a blank layer and add a color to that, and then apply some sort of a fancy effect using blends to get an outcome in that case. Is there any other questions that people have? Yeah, that kind of covers it today. Rick said, "This was great. Thank you very much. Got a lot up to speed with my work with the AI. I appreciate your efforts very much." You're so welcome, Rick. That's awesome. Daryl, thank you. Very helpful tutorial. Awesome. Not said, "Understood." Thank you, Adam. George, thanks. Clayton says, "Have to go, but thanks for the workshop. It was great. It was great that you limited the scope, so wasn't trying to do too much." Yeah, yeah. Drinking from a fire hose. Awesome. Thank you, Clayton. I appreciate that you you mentioned that. Greg asked, on image number 2, can you add blue sky? I'd like to see how it handles through the leaves. Image number 2. Image number 2 was this image here. Just to be clear, so I'm understanding, is it this film strip, this little guy? No. Okay. So what one are we referring to? What image? Second. This one? On image number 2, the trees. Well, I was interacting with this image predominantly, and it doesn't have any trees, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to. But I'm happy to do that for you. John, you're welcome. Next to the lady. So this is the image you're referring to. Yeah. Okay. So you want to, can you add a blue sky? I'd like to see how it handles through the leaves, the trees. So just to understand this correctly, you want to get rid of the mountain and you want to replace that, like just leave the trees but remove the mountain. Is that my understanding, Greg?